Uh, 5 days ago was the 159th anniversary of when that Dakota Removal Act went into effect, and the Dakota people were forcibly removed from the state of Minnesota. And I just want you to think about what you have done in the last 5 days, where you have walked, where you have driven, what buildings you have been in, passed by. How many things did you come in contact with that were named after Alexander Ramsay or Henry Sibley? And these are the heroes we lift up in this story. And it is an unending task, and trust me, it is unfair that the onus of changing this narrative falls upon us as Native people. But it is a work that I am called to do, and I know that our guest this evening is also called to do. I'm just going to go ahead and say it, that the Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy is a dear friend of mine, an invaluable treasure in my life, and really, I could imagine no better partner in this call to decolonize the church and to turn an old familiar narrative on its head and to finally get down to some truth-telling. So would you please welcome Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy.
Hello. I know we've been sitting for a little while, so you can wiggle just a little bit if you would like while I am telling you a little bit about myself. I am okay with that. I don't know about you, but sitting right in front of the air coming out, oh my goodness, it's cold. My name is, I can't even say doctor yet. I just can't believe in 2 days. Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy. My Lakota name is Mato Washde Winyan, which means good bear woman. And we're going to slowly get through these. That is my son, Kieran, who is now 9. And his name is Shungila, which is red fox. He was named by his grandparents. I come from the Oglala Lakota tribe, Sioux tribe, so you're going to hear me kind of go back and forth in using some language of, I'll say Lakota, or I may say Dakota, or I may say Sioux, and is actually all in the sense the same. We all come, the Dakota, or Lakota, or you'll hear Nakota on rare occasions, is actually what it is a dialect. So it tells us kind of where in geography where we were located, right? But we are all part of the Ocheti Sakowin, which is the Sioux Nation. So think of it like the state of Minnesota, and then you've got your towns, right, or your counties, right? So it's kind of that way. And so I am, as we've mentioned, going to defend my thesis in 2 days. I am the first Native woman theologian in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And honestly, there aren't very many Native women theologians. So very excited and a little nervous going into a big field. But it's important. My work that I've learned, I don't think I ever imagined I would be standing in front of people, and I do this quite often now, talking about my family and who I am and what we believe, or how we live our lives. It's always been something that has been a conversation that has been kind of more of a quiet conversation, or my family didn't talk about it too often, especially my mother, because my mother grew up at a time when she was unable to, she couldn't legally speak her own language, right? She couldn't, we couldn't practice practice our spirituality out in the open. My mother alone, she was a part of the Indian boarding school system. So it's as you can see, it's not that distant of a past. And so up here you're going to see my mother is on the top there. She is a pastor in the ELCA. My brother Sean, who is he's my older brother. He goes by the sous chef, and he does his work just as much in Indigenous, decolonizing Indigenous food systems. And my father, Gerald, who is he is a rancher and a retired banker, and he used to always say he could play cowboys and Indians by himself. And that there on the on the left there is my grandfather, John. Now, when we talk as Native people, when we talk about our family, and you're going to hear this, and I will say grandmother, it could mean right now, in a bit, I'll introduce you to my 3 times great-grandmother, but this was my grandfather, my 3-time great-grandfather, John Conroy, Washikula, who fought in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He was 18 years old in this picture, and this was taken just a few months after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And if you look very closely to his belt, you will see the Niobrara cross that he wore, which is Episcopalian. And my son, when he talks about his grandfather, and he loves my dad, Gerald, up here, but when he talks about his grandfather, you'll hear these stories, and then people get shocked to know that actually who he talks about the most is his grandpa John. And that's because that's how we grow up, that there is no separation in that time per se. It's because of the connection that we have. And we carry this connection, and we all do. We all carry this connection with our families. We often just don't think about it in that way, right? The best thing is that how God has created us. And God has created us in this way that we are connected through these generations. As an Indigenous person, it's not that difficult for me to think about and sit here and think about the stories that I heard. And I don't see them as so distant in the past because I heard them so much. But that pain and that trauma that comes through those stories, I feel. And that's kind of a part of what we call generational trauma, right? It's that the blood that runs through me, runs through my mother, runs through from her mother, and so on. And we are connected in that way. And those pains and the traumas and the experiences that they felt, that they experienced, it carries through to us. And there's that understanding of that connection, that we have this deep connection, that when we talk about the history of what you're just learning here, we really feel it. Because it's that trauma is able to carry through. So we carry that pain, and it's something that in my work I've been trying to figure out a way as to how can I often get asked the question, how can you be a Christian and a Native? Like, how do you what is it that you believe, and how do you even find a space for both of those? But the thing is, I never grew up that way. I never grew up where there was one or the other. That one day I was a practicing Christian, and the next I was Native. There was no separation in that at all. We were never talked about it that way. The way that I grew up was through the stories of my ancestors, my grandparents, my family, and there was no this or that. It was, this is how God created us. That how God created us is exactly how God intended us to be. And I always say that if we were all the same, it would be really boring, right? God made us unique and different on purpose. But that uniqueness creates a really amazing community. And the stories that you were just watching, that history that we just sat and we watched, are about my grandparents. So on the left is my grandmother, my three times great grandmother Margaret. She was a part of she lived in the internment camp, the prison camp at Fort Snelling. On this side is my uncle, her brother. He was one who was imprisoned in the camp waiting his execution. Happily, they survived. They both did. But their stories continue. Their stories don't end just at Fort Snelling as they were shipped off on the boats. As you can see, the middle part here is once my uncle eventually found his family. They had to restart. And that's what I kind of want to talk about this evening. I wouldn't be standing here telling you about my faith as a Native Christian, telling you about my beliefs or even our history, if it weren't for the strength and the resilience of the women of our tribe. So my grandmother and my uncle were a part of the Santee people. And the Santee people, one of the things that my grandmother used to talk about, very rarely, from what I was told, but she did share it because it was important. We are oral storytellers, right? Even as Christians, that is how we know we're Christian, right? We've learned this through the stories that have been passed down through generations. The same is as those for us, for Indigenous people. And my grandmother would tell these stories. She was really young when she was marched for, I think it was 150 miles. Elderly, women and children. And if you think about it, we are in the midst of climate change, right? And so the winters we have now, which I know my sister who lives in Washington State complains that like we have these awful winters, but it can't even compare to what they were then when my grandmother was young. And to imagine that you had to walk with elderly and with children and babies, 150 miles. Not only did you have to walk, you had to walk through towns of angry people. And they were mad because they were accustomed to hating Native people. And so they would throw food, they would throw rotten food, they would throw rocks, they would yell and they would scream at them. And at times they would fire guns. So on that 150-mile walk, those 1,600 people of women and children and elderly, a large number of them didn't survive, whether it was because of the weather or it's because they were killed along the way. My grandmother was a healer, and it's a part of something that runs through our family. So as they were traveling to Fort Snelling, they were uncertain of what their future was going to look like. Right? It got to the point that the way they were living was humiliating. It wasn't just poverty. It was humiliating poverty. They were forced to find food or dig out pieces of grain and things in feces. And they were heartbroken because the land that they lived on, it was always so uncertain because of the lies that were happening. So they didn't even know if the land that they were going to live on was where they were going to always be. They didn't know what home was anymore. And so there was a lot of sadness. And so a lot of the stories that my grandmother told were really sad. It's hard when I can't see this. My mother once said this, and she said, you know, when you aren't viewed as real people, it's a lot easier to run over your rights and lose your identity. I'll read it again. When you are not viewed as real people, it's a lot easier to run over your rights and lose your identity. And that's a reason why a lot of the work that I do, I find really important. Because it was the one thing. So this is a picture of what the camp looked like, the prison camp. Cold and pretty desolate. It was during winter. A lot of this time, a lot of people died. And it was my grandmother's job to care for the people. So not only did she quietly help bury some of these people, of her people, she was kind of like, I talk about it as, it's like pastoral care. When somebody needs to talk, whether it's a celebration or not, sadness. So you saw one of these pictures on this side. So this is actually Little Crow's wife and two of their children. The other side of my family, which is kind of amazes me as I learn more and more about the history of my people and my family, was my great aunt. Her grandfather was Little Crow. And so the stories that I grew up that she would tell me, I never put two and two together for the longest time. The women in my family were so strong. So as my grandmother cared for the people of her tribe, they were put onto the river boats that you saw in the video. And they went all the way down into Missouri, to St. Louis, and they were moved on to cattle barges. And if you know anything about cattle barges, they're not anything like a riverboat. And they are just straight. And so during that time, they didn't stop. The boats kept moving. The weather wasn't always good. And people died on that boat, on those barges. Now, if you think about it, the way my grandmother talked about it was there wasn't any room to sit because they were so crowded. There were no bathrooms, so they had to stand in their own feces. And along the way, people did die, but they weren't going to put people over the boats, so they held on to their dead until they could get to their destination. I can't even imagine what it would be like. They eventually got to Crow Creek, which was specifically made for the Santee Sioux. And they buried a large number of the dead. But they continued to die because it was a really desolate place. Unfortunately, Crow Creek is still there, and it is part of a reservation, and it is still kind of a very desolate area. And so they have these mounds that you see to this day where they buried a lot of their dead. Eventually, one of my grandmother's daughters died. And she never quite survived. She never healed from that. But Crow Creek was such an awful place that even the U.S. government decided it wasn't a good place. So they moved them again. And this is where they ended up in Santee, Nebraska, which is kind of on the border of, I think it's Nebraska, South Dakota, and almost into Minnesota. And if it weren't for my grandmother and the women, the thing is, we are a matrilineal people. So we were used to the balance of men and women, right? That we had that there wasn't this hierarchy per se. That how our tribes or how our villages were run were equally ran. But when your brothers, your husbands, the young men were all stripped from this tribe, it was up to the women to rebuild. And that's the part of the story that I really hold on to. Because the house that you saw earlier was the house that my grandmother built with her children. They not only built homes, the missionary at that time, the missionaries started to move down and around the people. So the women of the tribe understood that they needed to survive, so they started learning the different techniques from the wives of the missionaries. So they learned to sew. They learned to do different things of farming. They built schools. They created one of the first schools for Native children. And they built one of the first churches in the area, which is still there in Santee. So the photos that you were just seeing were there were some of my family in those pictures as well. So while my grandmother was there, my uncle was still up in Mankato. Eventually he and my grandfather and some other relatives were given some choices. My uncle was moved to another prison camp. So he eventually was released, but while he was imprisoned in Mankato, he became Christian. So he was baptized. And my grandfather used to always say that it wasn't the message that Native people had a problem with when it comes to Christianity, because they understood the message. They understood Christ. They understood his stories and what he was teaching, because at that point, Native people, we were already living a godly-like life. We were already living like Christ wanted us to. But it was the people that were coming that didn't want to take the time to understand and to learn who we were, and honestly just how we celebrated our relationship with God's creation and each other. And so what they have a problem with was the messengers, not the message. But that's hard when we carry so much trauma and pain that today a part of my work has been trying to figure out how can I help my Lakota people not be ashamed of who you are, that the things that we believe, how we celebrate our relationship with God's creation, that is just a natural part of who we are. And we don't have to make up those excuses. And how do I remove that anger from this narrative that it was God or that it was Christ that did this trauma and this damage, because it wasn't. And that's a hard thing to do when we talk about reconciliation and we talk about reparations, and people want to jump right to reparations right away. And that's a problem because, when you talk about reconciliation, we can't reconcile. Reconciliation means that we have to repair our relationship, and with Native people and with Christians and congregations and denominations, to be really honest, there hasn't been a relationship to repair. So that makes it difficult for my work in some ways is because there are a lot of Native people like me who have this deep spirituality, but who also carry this trauma and this anger, and it's hard to release it because we see that, right? And so, but if it weren't for people like my grandmother, who did what she did to survive so that I could stand here today and actually talk about the things that I believe, right? That how I celebrate my spirituality. Like, we all don't pray the same, right? Our spiritual practices are all different, and that's how it's meant to be, because each one of you has a relationship with God or Christ, and that's how it's meant to be in that way and how you do it, and there's no right or wrong way to celebrate your relationship with God. But see, there hasn't been that opportunity for me as a Native Christian to say that and to talk about that. And so a lot of my work is trying to find that balance and then move forward from all this amazing work that a lot of Native theologians before me have done, where they have named the hurt. So people like George Tinker and Vine Deloria, right? It wasn't just till recently till I realized that Vine Deloria, not necessarily, he was not a theologian, but he wrote a book that many of us, if you haven't looked at, as God has read, it'll ignite a fire one way or another, and when you read it, right? But his father was one of the elders that I grew up listening to when I was really little. And it never just clicked with me until I was talking with my mom a couple months ago as I was doing some of my work. And I was writing about all these elders, and I was that one child that was always sitting with anybody that was about 50 years older than I was and listening to stories. And his dad was one of them. And that was the coolest thing. I didn't put I just remember a cool old guy, telling me stories. Or that my grandfather lived on the reservation in South Dakota, and he had a ranch, and we lived kind of on the back 60 of the ranch, and he taught me what it meant to walk in prayer. And it was, I tell this story that one day we were walking, and he said he grabbed me, so I went to walk with him on the ranch, and we would stop, and we would stop at these little sprouts. But he wouldn't say anything, right? And my grandfather, he lived in what they call the sand hills. And so but it had this tall, they were just hills, but they had these tall golden grass, right? And on their ranch, they had the tree belt that kind of protected. If anybody knows anything about ranching or farming, they often, when you live in desolate places, you plant these trees to help block all the wind and the rain and the snow and all of that, right? So they had this beautiful forest to me. And I remember, there was just all these sprouts, but otherwise it was just hills, but you could just smell, like it always smelled wet, and you can just smell the grass, like wet grass, right? And my grandfather stopped, and we looked at the sprout, and we'd go to another one, and there was this another sprout coming out of the ground, and we kept stopping at all these places, and then eventually we walked through the corrals and up onto the hill that overlooked the homestead. And we sat there. And if there's anything else that I learned from my grandfather was snacking. So whenever we stopped or we traveled, we would always stop at some sort of any town. You could not pass through a town if you didn't stop at a gas station or a grocery store to get a chocolate bar. Or even if my grandmother wouldn't let him, he'd sneak one over, right? And so we sat up there, and he pulls out some candy, so we're sitting up there eating, and we're just listening. And I remember hearing like the little bees kind of floating around us, and you could hear the horses stomping down in the corrals because there's just flies. It was summertime, and there were flies, and you could just hear them. And eventually, my grandfather got up, and we walked down to my forest. because I was the only girl, and there were my brother and my cousins, so there were 5 boys and there were me. That's why I was often with the elders in my family or other people. But I had this spot in my little forest, and I would sit there, and this tree, it was like it hugged me. And you would sit in this tree, and I remember I'd snuggle in, and it just kind of curved. And that's where I would go when I was hiding from my cousins and my brother. And and we sat there, and my grandfather was looking at it, and he said, what is this? And I said, well, this is my favorite spot. And he says, yeah, but does this mean anything? And I said, well, it's my friend. Because honestly, like I said, unless I wanted to be stuck in a haystack because my brother shoved me in a haystack, I would, I found my own things to do. And he kind of looked at me and he said, well, he said, do you know what we were doing? And I said, no. And he said, well, this tree's really old and we're going to have to cut it down. And I went, what? And I remember crying, and I just started crying. And I took off running to the house, and I ran through, and I ran past my grandmother, and I ran into her room and jumped on her bed, and I was crying and crying. Because to me, that was part of my friend, that was family, this tree. And it was like my one safe haven. And my grandfather was like, we're going to cut it down. And I just couldn't even picture what life would be like without this safe haven that I had. And my grandmother, I could hear her say, Dad, what's going on? Uh-oh. Usually meant he was in trouble. And eventually she came in and got me and said, you need to go talk to your grandpa. So I go walking out, and my grandfather's standing there, and he has this handkerchief, and he hands it to me, and you open it up, and it has some sage and some tobacco in it. And so he said, follow me. So we went to the first stop, and he said, do you know what we are doing? I said, no. What my grandfather was doing when we stopped at each one of those places was he was thanking the sprouts in the ground, because we were going to have to move the trees. Because you also don't know much about farming or ranching. If you don't protect the land and those sprouts start growing, they could pull up the road, or they can kind of damage the ecosystem, right? And so he was going to move them. And so we stopped at every single one of them. And I thanked every single one of them for the life that they were bringing to the ranch. And we said a prayer. So that entire time that we were walking around, he was actually praying. And I kind of wish that I was smart enough then to know what he was teaching me. Because that was what he was doing, was teaching me how to walk in prayer. Then he took me to my tree, and we prayed. And I sat there, and I actually talked to it for quite a while. And eventually it did come down. But this tells you how spoiled I was. He made it into a tree house. So I was well loved. But that was how, as Native people, that's how we learn. Is that when we learn through our actions, that our elders taught us through our actions, and sometimes through our words, but that we can tell the same story over and over, and each time we hear it, we hear what we need to hear. And that's kind of how we are as Christians as well, because that's what Christ intended. Like, that's where I always saw that similarity between Christ and like my grandfather. Right? No, I'm not saying, but it was that he would tell me a story, but it was up to me to figure out what that meant. That, and Christ was pretty sneaky when you read these stories, right? And he never really tells us the answer. We have to figure it out. But see, that's the thing. There are so many similarities, and it's not about comparison, really. But this is just who we are as Indigenous people. And so when we have the opportunity like this to be able to share our stories, or that I can stand here and talk a little bit about what spirituality is for me, that you can understand, that you can hear in my story. You can hear God without me having to compare it to an idea of what it should sound like. Because we grow up knowing that God is in all that we do. So in my tribe we have, this is Black Elk. So Nicholas Black Elk, which maybe some of you have read Black Elk Speaks. He was an important part of our tribe and for a lot of people. Now, what he says is the Lakol Wichowaki, which means it carries a belief that when words are spoken, that speaker's soul and spirit are attached to those words. So when a Lakota elder speaks, their words are taken very seriously as the persons are listened carefully. Our words are sacred. Our stories are sacred. And we learn that. We know that. We know that as Christians. We learn these stories and the importance of them. And Black Elk understood that. And if it weren't for him sharing some of the things that he did share, we would have lost some of the ceremonies that carry through our generations. So as Lakota, our spirituality that has been shared through generations of storytelling can be seen as a deeper understanding of what Creator God has always intended by the consistent lived experience of the Lakol Wichowaki, which just means that we are able to live our lives of who we are as how God created us to be. And so the stories that you heard today, the history that you hear, I think we often kind of get this question of, well, I'm not connected to those stories. I don't have a relative, or I moved from the state from somewhere else. You may not be related through blood, but we are through faith. And that's important. Because if you're looking for a connection and how to understand what all of this stuff means, it is that. So these pictures that you see behind me, you see that, when we have land acknowledgements, often they have this tendency, which are great, but they have this tendency to make it sound like as Native people, we are not here. That we once walked this land, we're still here, right? So when you're thinking about your land acknowledgements, or when you read one, or if you're creating one, what does it say? Think about it as a form of activism. How are you motivating people to act? And then what are you doing in that to teach people about what you are doing and a little bit of history? Because we have Native people here that are speaking up, and there's so much to be involved in and be a part of. But you have a pretty powerful voice, more than we do sometimes. Because, as I think Jim Bear says, there are 0.8% of the U.S. population. Not 0.8%, or not 8%, but 0.8%. So it's important to learn and to hear. And I still quote this every single time I talk. And I heard this from Jim Bear. So if it was, you saw Jim Bear 5 years ago or so, right? I remember Jim Bear saying one time, he said, I don't want to see you in 5 years at the same place and having not done anything. Right? So I'm curious. No, just kidding. Because I'm sure you heard this before. No, just kidding. But I think that's an important thing. Is just as Christ, when we hear our stories, when we hear these stories, there's always something to learn, right? So there's never a way for us to stay stagnant in this, and we're all activists. It's how we do it. Whether it's creating spaces for people to talk, for Indigenous people, or whether it's creating your land acknowledgements, or finding ways to create change and create spaces for people to have their voices heard. There are so many ways, or educating yourself. So, I believe we have questions and answer time. I know there was a lot. I don't know, Jim. Okay, I get around this. Okay. So I know there was a lot to hear. It's a lot to hear. I mean, that history, even there were some things I went, wow. It's a lot. It's a lot to take in. But are there questions? Yeah.
I go to Fort Snelling for the land, but I haven't ever been in the buildings. Is there an acknowledgement in the building of what happened there?
Honestly, it's been years since I've actually been inside the historic fort. I know that in their more recent history, in their more recent history, within about the last 10 years, they have been working with Dakota people to uplift some of that story. And certainly outside the fort, there is now signage that indicates some of this story. But, 30 years ago when I was growing up and visiting Fort Snelling as a little child, there was none of this story inside the buildings. And there's also other stories in Fort Snelling that really need to be lifted up, like the vast amount of enslaved black people that were brought to Fort Snelling and forced to work under slavery in Minnesota. These are those hidden dark narratives that intentionally get left out when we as a state or we as a church, tell our histories.
Hi. I wonder if you could sketch for us the relationship between the historical event of the mass killing and the Walker Art Center's choice to have a scaffold erected and then have it dismantled, and how that's an example of, I don't know, is that part of reparations? Is that part of awareness? Is that, what, could you draw that connection for us?
Sure. Well, and when I talked about that, my uncle and my grandfather and some cousins were imprisoned. Two would be what we would consider cousins. Two of my relatives were part of the Dakota 38. So they were part of the 38 that were hung, right? And I talked a little bit about, there's a thing called historical trauma. It's a little bit like generational trauma, right? But there's this connection because it's connected to the history of this land, right? The history that so when we're here, sometimes there are things present day that trigger, right? So my son was 5 years old. And we go down there all the time to play, and, he loves the big chicken, and the cherry on the spoon, right? Because that's what it's created for, right? It's created for families, for people to walk, to look at art, to learn. And there's definitely in the centuries there's some questionable art. Just say. But when you are that connected to your family and your history, right? So my son, like I said, my son knows our family history so well that he talks about not just my Grandpa John, he talks about my grandmother and my uncle. And my grandfather, who at the time was given the choice to stay imprisoned, or you leave your family and you marry a white Christian woman. And that's what a lot of people had to do, a lot of Native men, right? So there are all this trauma, all these choices that we had to make, that we had to hide ourselves, And we're trying to move past that trauma, but we're consistently faced with it. And I'm standing there with my son. And someone decides that one of the largest execution of the history of our country can be a playground for my son. That they created steps for you to be able to walk up and pull a lever. And that's art. If you sit here and you watch this and you hear my stories of that this is my family, and then tell me that that was okay. Because it's not. Because I was forced to tell my son what that meant. That is not art. Art can be provocative, but it shouldn't cause that kind of trauma. And that is what we as Indigenous people in Minnesota have to live with, because my son doesn't learn this history in school. I didn't learn this history in school. And so that, I guess, would be my answer to your question, is that that is not okay. There is nothing about that. And not even just for Indigenous people was that okay. Yeah. Any other questions? That's a hard segue there, but I always say that, depending upon who we are as people of color, some people are able to answer questions and leave that space and some aren't. I am one of those people that I'm an educator and a teacher. It does take some, a little bit out of me, but I also know if we don't have these spaces for people to be able to ask the questions, how are we going to learn, right? So, and I will tell you if it's not a good question, but if you have questions or thoughts, yeah.
What did the 0.8% refer to?
0.8%, do you want to explain that better? You're good at it.
That is, we are, as Indigenous people, we make up 0.8% of the nation's population. And so when I do public storytelling, sacred sites tours, I talk about how we don't have the capacity. 0.8% doesn't get anyone's attention. We are what's considered academically, we're statistically insignificant, which means we have gone through our lives, we've gone through our entire academic careers not being counted and being ignored. And so I use that statistic, that 0.8%, to say that we don't have it in and of ourselves to get stuff done. We have the energy, we have the passion, we have the voices, but we don't have the influence. And so I use that as a call for allyship and accomplices in the work.
Thank you. I think that I probably know the answer, but I still wanted to ask the question. Is there any knowledge of any of the of any non-native people that have told the story from a different perspective? Because part of what I I guess when it comes to racism, all different kinds, it really should not be left up to you to tell us. As far as people who are ancestors of the racists, I would think that would be pretty wonderful, but I just thought I'd raise the topic.
Yeah, so in the film, Mark Dietrich and David Nichols are both non-Indigenous historians. They're white guys who work to tell that story, but they do so in relationship with Dakota people, and that's the important part. Because when you ask, are there white people who are telling the story from a different perspective, the hairs on the back of my neck start going up. Because if you drive through southwestern Minnesota, even today, filled with white people who are telling the story from a different perspective, and you still hear that it's, a bunch of savages rose up unprovoked. Like, you still hear that. But no, I understand the nature of your question. I'm just telling you how I responded to, yeah. But there are Mark Dietrich and David Nichols, who are featured in the film, are some scholars of this history who do a responsible job. That's the reason they're featured. What's her name? Mary. She has 3 names. Come on, someone know. Mary Lethert Wing. Anyway, she is also a Minnesota historian who does a good job with this story. So
There is going to be some emotional labor for us as Indigenous people in telling these stories, right? Yeah, and it's hard to see. If you get to know me, though, I cry a lot. I do, but that is the person who I am, right? Because I feel this. I really do feel what I speak, and it is difficult. It's difficult to tell my family's story or my story, but the thing is, we don't get this spaces very much, right? That's why I get so excited about my brother and the work that he does with Indigenous food systems, right? I mean, we have not seen a Native movement like that really kick in, and he is everywhere right now, which is great, but that doesn't happen too often. And so, yes, there are people that can help tell our stories, but it's also important for us to tell our stories. So we balance it, I think, is the best that we can, because also, as you know, when someone tells a story, it's never going to be the same as the other person. So
yeah,
right.
and you think about it. I think it took us until the late '90s before we even had a movie that was produced by a Native producer and had Native cast. That was Signals, great movie. Go out and watch it. But it took us into really the last 2 years before we see ourselves represented on like television networks and streaming services. Mm-hmm. And so, there are shows like Reservation Dogs, which was winning all kinds of awards. And that just blew up in Indian country because we were all like, this is the first time we can watch a show. And there's another one called Rutherford Falls. It was the first time we could watch a comedy. We could watch, people that we know.
Molly from Denali. Oh,
yeah, be funny.
Cartoon, but great one.
In situation comedies. And so, yeah, I appreciate the question, and I don't want to minimize it, but I think, and I don't want to speak for Kelly, but I think my thought is, you need to listen to me now, and yet, as Kelly said, there is emotional labor. Kelly and I conduct sacred sites tours where we go down. Right now, we go down multiple times a week, and we sit at the site of the concentration camp, and we tell the story there. And it's an emotional labor, but I wouldn't trust anyone else to do it.
Yeah. Well, one reason why I asked is that I had a 6th grade teacher who was just about retirement age, who said that her mother was involved in the story. And it was a very small piece. But it would have real power if the other perspective would be the perspective of someone who saw the evil that happened.
Yeah, and that is, so those are powerful moments. So I mentioned Kelly and I do these sacred sites tours where we bring groups in. I still recall a number of years ago, this is before Kelly joined me in this work, I remember one time a young white woman was on the tour. She listened to the whole story. And afterwards, with tears in her eyes, she came up to me and she said, I grew up down in the western Minnesota River Valley, kind of by the Lower Sioux Agency and that. Multiple generations of my family are from there. I'm a direct descendant from people who were killed, from white people who were killed during the War of 1862. And with tears in her eyes, she said, as I was listening to you tell the story, I was remembering the narrative I heard from my family about this time. And it was that narrative of, there's a bunch of savagery and unprovoked violence. And she said, I wanted to go back in time and tell my relatives the context of what was happening. That people are literally picking through horse droppings to look for oats to eat. I wanted to tell them this, and she broke down and she said, but I know it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't have mattered. And yeah. Yeah.
See, if we leave the narrative to that, right, then we are stuck where we have been for so long. I'm going to read one really quick, very short. So as I mentioned, Little Crow, Te Oyate Duta, is my grandfather on the other side of my family. So I will speak up. Okay. I'm going to read this excerpt, and this comes from an interview. So this comes through the Minnesota Historical Society, and it's an interview with the daughter of the man that killed Little Crow. On the 3rd of July, my father and brother Chauncey left Hutchinson to look after the stock which had been clipping fragment missing. I don't know what that means. Okay. Oh, clip. They're missing the fragment of this in this story. As they were following an old logging road which lay through heavy timber, my father cautioned Chauncey to be more quiet, for there were always the possibility of an Indian lurking in the bush. Chauncey laughed at the idea, but did not finish his reply before he exclaimed, "There's two there, Father." The men separated, one going into the brush at either side of the roadway, Little Crow and his son. The appearing one had been picking berries, and saw my father and brother at the moment they were discovered. Both parties fired at the same time. None of the shots took effect, and my father reloaded. At the second shot, he saw one of the Indians leap to his feet and cry out and fall forward. A second shot from one of the Indians wounded my father in the shoulder. As he crouched in the bushes, the ball plowed in a furrow about 6 inches in length across his left shoulder. Nathan Lamson crouched near the spot where he had entered the timber, afraid to move because he feared there might be other Indians nearby. So Chauncey crawled away after the second exchange of shots and returned to the stockade in Hutchinson about 11 o'clock that night. My father remained on the scene of the shooting until morning. When Chauncey returned, he asked where his father was. "He's all right," Chauncey said. "He's out in the woods." My mother fainted when my brother returned alone, and I recall begging the rough old doctor who was attending her not to let my mother die. At daylight, my father returned to the stockade. Soon after my father came in bleeding and tired, soldiers arrived from the fort lined up to go gather the body of the Indian. I remember that an older brother of mine was second from the captain as they set out. When they returned, they had the body of Little Crow on a blanket in the bottom of a wagon. With the other children, I climbed up on the wheel to see the Indian. The body of Little Crow was placed near McGraw's store, which all the village might see it. He had been shot through the stomach. Little Crow's body was left out for people to see. My grandfather's body. Eventually, his bones were put on show in our state capitol. And then when my great aunt was young, the boy that was with Little Crow, her grandfather, they went to the Minnesota Historical Society and saw the bones of her grandfather hanging in a museum. Eventually, our family got back the body, and he was buried in Flandreau, South Dakota, with about 10 people. It was my aunt and her husband, her mother, and her uncle. And I remember her telling me the story that her uncle, their father, her grandfather, was afraid to have what happened to his father happen to him, that picture that you saw. That is our family. He was afraid of what happened to his father. So when he was older and he died, her grandmother took his body and buried him somewhere in Minnesota and didn't tell anybody where, because they did not want to have happen what happened to Little Crow. But if we are left with allowing people, non-native people, to tell our stories, that story of what I just read is what people learn. And they don't hear the humanness of the people that they're writing and talking about. So our voices are important, and there is definitely emotional labor. But in some ways it's necessary in order for us to be able to have that opportunity to tell that story. Every time, and then I say, are there more questions? But I think we're also getting a little late, so I'm not sure how long we're supposed to go. Yes? Okay.
The word reparations has not come up again. And when I think of that word, which we have discussed in this church to find no solution, and yet it seems that part of reparations is telling the story and having people who have not had that history accept that history as important and to retell it themselves, to when it's appropriate to their families, to their children, to I'm an educator, and I was thinking, what could we do that would be educationally appropriate and still tell the truth? And at what ages could this story be like those seeds that your grandfather planted in their young minds so that they look at the history of all peoples as there is more to this story. How is this story like my story? How is it different than my story? And what do we wish for them to have as their story?
Well, I think that's, yeah, there's learning, there's always teaching, right? I think for me personally, what I have told congregations, organizations, we're going to start my own congregation here shortly, is to learn about the history of your church, not just when it was established, but really look at the history of it and when it was established, right? When this was built, how did it affect the Dakota and the Indigenous people here? How did it disrupt the lives of the Indigenous people where it's located? When you start looking at the history of your church that way, it's really interesting. But that's important because then when you come to someone like me or Jim Bear and you say, hey, I've got $10,000 we want to give you to do some work, right? We don't go, it's just a bunch of, no offense here, but white people offloading some money so they don't feel guilty. But then we see that you're doing some work to learn about this land and what that means when you talk about a land acknowledgement. That's what I mean about action, right? Dig a little bit deeper. Richfield UMC, the United Methodist Church in Richfield, Pastor Nate, I think he used to be here, right? He is one of my dear friends and colleagues. But take a look at their page. They are doing some ongoing work on land acknowledgements, but look at what they did, because what they do is they've named what they're doing, but that they're still doing some work. They're finding out what's at the heart of the ministry that they have at that congregation, and that is how they're helping people connect in their church, and then they're connecting in different ways to Indigenous people here locally. So you can kind of see their journey, and that's important. So what can you do here? I mean, it has to be mentioned. I'm really sorry, but to talk about reparation work and stuff, and then and decolonizing, and then standing in a room full of white Jesus is really difficult because we know that Jesus was not white, right? Not trying to be insulting because it takes a lot of work to do this kind of painting, right? But it's those little things that we don't notice, when we're creating these opportunities. Like, just really take a deep dive into some of the things and learn about why do we have these things here. Beautiful, by the way, but just saying, there are different ways that you can learn and change the narrative a little bit. I had to bring it up. Sorry about that. Okay.
Right. So, recognizing that we are woefully beyond the time that we were allotted for this, will you please take an opportunity to thank Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy for me. As was mentioned, this is the first part in a three-part series over the next couple of months for this. So remind me, June 13th is our next gathering where we will learn about how systematic and institutionalized racism affected the housing industry and still affects housing, particularly in Minneapolis. So join us for that. Again, on behalf of my colleague, Reverend Pamela Gojiri, and myself, thank you very much for this discussion. Hopefully it has been meaningful and beneficial, and I look forward to seeing you on June 13th. Oh.